Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the third episode of our Talks on Tap interview series. With me today is Professor Erica Dick, and Erica is a Canada Research Chair and Professor of History at the University of Saskatchewan. So thank you very much for joining me today. Erica recently spoke at our Talks on Tap event downtown Saskatoon at the Woods Ale House. Now this is a mostly monthly speaker series coordinated by myself, Erin, Maloney, Catherine Reyes, and Tina Watts. We're four graduate students at the University of Saskatchewan in the Toxicology program. And so we've gone a little bit off our beaten path having a historian in, but that's because she happens to have a pretty unique and interesting specialization. She does most of her work with the therapeutic use of psychedelics. So I'm curious, what's a day in the life of someone with your specialization?
It's pretty exciting. I read a lot of paper, and all of it is acid-free. And
strictly reading paper.
Strictly reading paper. No, I mean, as historians, we look through the old texts, and often these are handwritten documents of people who had experiences with LSD. Sometimes those are staff or researchers, and often they're patients or volunteers. And so we've been combing through, we've got about 1,300 records now of individuals who came through the LSD trials, and so that's part of what we've been doing the research on lately.
Wow. So that sounds like an awful lot of work, even if you have a lot of hands on deck for that. Certainly not something that you'd be prepared to tackle as a complete, fresh individual, which of course you're not. You've got something of a storied history yourself. Can you give us a little bit of information before we get into the meat and potatoes of your Talks on Tap talk of where you came from, what your educational background was, and we're going to sort of try and get to what led you to what you're working on today.
Sure. Well, I mean, I grew up right here in Saskatoon and spent the first little while trying to escape. And I did my undergrad degree at Dalhousie University in Canadian history and sort of general Canadian history. I came back to Saskatoon and I worked here. I worked for the government for a little while, and I also did my master's in the history of education. And I looked at the ways that student loans did or did not improve access to higher education for Saskatchewan students. And it was partly through that, actually, that I came across references to LSD studies that were being advertised in the sheaf. You could get $5 if you would volunteer to come in and have an experience and let yourself be recorded and have your experiences recorded.
So these were in old editions of the sheaf that still exists today?
Indeed.
Wow.
Yes. And I did some research for a historian of science on the medical experimentation that had been going on in Canada using LSD primarily. And then a year later, I started working on my PhD, and I moved to Toronto. I did my PhD at McMaster University in Hamilton, and then I moved to Edmonton. I was the co-director of the medical history program there, where we were starting to bring historians into the medical classroom and think about ways to use history to give a different perspective on medical education and lifelong learning within the clinical curriculum.
Well, you're being pretty productive even throughout all that time. So your PhD thesis alone, if I remember correctly, actually got published as a full-fledged book, did it not?
Yeah, this is fairly common with the historians. We tend to preserve our dissertations as a sort of first draft of a book. So this is slightly different. There are a few different chapters or some changes to it, but yeah, it started off as my dissertation.
So you were part of the medical history studies at the University of Saskatchewan, and you were saying that you were doing a similar program in Alberta. So is this a continuation of the work that you were doing there, or are they just doing similar but unrelated lines of inquiry?
It's sort of similar and unrelated at the same time. And at the University of Alberta, I was cross-appointed between the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry and Arts, so in history and medicine. And here I'm only in history, although I'm an adjunct or an associate member of the psychiatry department. So I have an opportunity to work with medical students, with psychiatry faculty and residents. And I do that, but more on a volunteer basis than as an assignment of duties. So now we can really concentrate on building the historical focus on the medical history, mental health history, and I have a number of colleagues working in adjacent areas, so it's really quite a coup to be able to work together with such talented people. Yeah, so
this is something then that you're teaching as a history prof, like within the medical school to medical students, and
to some degree, yeah. We co-host a seminar series, and we try to co-host events where we can. And I'm in the classroom a few hours a year, which is not very much, but it's very difficult to get into the medical program. They have a lot to learn.
So obviously, everything during the past wasn't solely based around the LSD, the medical history of LSD, but you said you started to encounter some of these things in the sheaf. Is that what really spurred your interest, or were you seeing things from other resources as well that were indicating, hey, this is kind of a fruitful area of lots of backstory?
Well, it's surprising. I'd like to say that, I think it's a more interesting story perhaps to say that I saw these and I really gravitated towards this history, or that, I started looking into medical experimentation and found these, incredible experiments that took place in this province. But in fact, it's a much more boring story than that. I was really curious as to how the healthcare reforms that were unfolding in Saskatchewan historically. So after Tommy Douglas's government wins in 1944, they embark in what becomes really internationally significant healthcare reforms, how to develop a public healthcare system that is not like the British system, that is certainly not like the American system, and how do we forge our own, which of course becomes the blueprint for Medicare. And it was really questions around the politics of healthcare reform that led me to discover a group of people who were coming from all over the place, who felt that this was a progressive place to engage in the kind of research that really stretched the limits, stretched the boundaries of what was acceptable in orthodox science and medicine at the time. And so LSD fit really neatly into that category. Working in the history of psychiatry where, instead of keeping people in asylums all the time, or instead of looking to Freud or Freudian psychodynamic theories as the main way of doing therapy for people with mental disorders, the LSD research was kind of outside of the frame of orthodox medicine. But here, there were very few critics. There were very few professionals, in fact. So they found ready collaborators, and it was easier in some respects in a place with very few middle-class professionals to collaborate across disciplines as well. And so the researchers who came here, some of them argued that this place became something of a political magnet for them. And it allowed them the kind of professional and research freedom to explore things that maybe they couldn't have done in a more cosmopolitan setting.
So you keep, when you're mentioning this, you're saying LSD was used and actually used therapeutically and in research settings in this province. Is this some kind of, special medical brand LSD, or are we really talking about the same stuff that I hear you can buy on blotter paper here and there?
Right. So Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, which then became Novartis eventually, was the only legitimate pharmaceutical producer of LSD throughout this period. So from 1943 until 1962, they pulled their supplies for a period, and then they replenished the market for a little while. They're the only legitimate suppliers, and by the mid-1960s, it becomes clear that, especially when they pull their supplies, that there are all sorts of 50 to 80 different kinds of substances circulating in different, mostly urban settings where these studies were done, suggesting that there are all sorts of things sold on blotter paper, bathtub acid, orange Kool-Aid acid, all of these things with some really amazing names, but none of those were necessarily pharmaceutical grade. There were a number of sort of copycat productions, and there were people certainly making this at home or using chemistry sets from high schools even. So Sandoz grade, pharmaceutical grade LSD was pretty rare, and it was regulated primarily through, in Canada at least, the health minister had to sign off on every research request.
So this went right up to the very top.
Absolutely.
Then, this kind of stuff. Wow, that's incredible. So what sort of things, there's a bit of a storied history for people who might be sort of amateur historians in the area. LSD's been put to a number of applications in the past, and actually if you want to take it right back to its roots with ergot, some, let's say, accidental experimentation may have been responsible for a lot of the witch trials that we're all familiar with. What sort of work was being done here, and how did it relate to work that was being done elsewhere? I'm thinking maybe in the States and some of the work they may have been up to.
Yeah, so early on, there were some of the researchers, primarily the ones that came here. So Humphrey Osmond was the sort of main linchpin for the research here in Saskatchewan, and he became the superintendent of the Weyburn Mental Hospital, or Provincial Mental Hospital at Weyburn. He was particularly interested in studies of hallucinations. So he looked back at some of those ergot studies and some of the early studies, even with the hashish trials and things like that, things that made people change their perception. Hallucinations are part of that, but also just things that disordered their patterns of thinking, the rhythms of thought. And he was very, very drawn to that. So he saw LSD as a window into those experiences. For him, it was a window into madness, a window into schizophrenia, which were the diagnosis of the majority of the patients he was dealing with. And he was very interested in trying to understand how to mimic those experiences so that you could better empathize with those people and better accommodate them, both in terms of hospital settings, but also in terms of reaching them through therapy. So if you can empathize with them, maybe you can learn how to listen to them in different ways so that their thoughts, their paranoid thoughts sometimes, don't sound so bizarre and illogical, but you can appreciate a kind of internal logic. And this was really the sort of area that he got into that got him reading about peyote trials, reading about Salem witch trials. That differs a little bit at the time. So he's starting in about the early 1950s. It differs from some of the work that's going on, primarily the stuff that we get to hear about from like MK Ultra trials, so CIA-sponsored trials into determining whether this drug might be used as a truth serum. This is the Cold War. They want to know if the Soviets are spying on them, and they want to know whether these drugs will actually force the truth out of someone, an elixir for truth. It doesn't really work that way. In fact, they found that people didn't care about the truth. They questioned whether there was a truth, and they questioned the whole nature of the Cold War. In fact, one researcher went on record suggesting that if Khrushchev and Nixon had taken LSD, there wouldn't have been a Cold War.
So they definitely got some interesting results out of that research. I guess just maybe not exactly the ones that they were going for. I really do like this idea of these people sitting down and being interrogated, and all they're getting in response is somebody eating Funyuns and maybe giving the exact stereotype of whatever anything someone on LSD in their head would be.
Those are the marijuana trials,
oh,
which
right.
they compared
Sorry,
them
excuse
with.
me. I'm very, very naive, so you'll have to forgive me anytime I make a misstep like that. So we got to head into our first break here, but we want to come sort of right back to this. We're going to start to delve a little bit more into what you were talking about for the Talks on Tap talk for us. And so as we're just going to break really briefly, and we'll be back with you in just a moment. So welcome back. In case you missed the intro at the very beginning there, I'm sitting here today with Dr. Erica Dick, who is a professor of history at the University of Saskatchewan. And we're just going to dive right back in sort of where we left off there, getting into some of the contents of your talk that you had given us for Talks on Tap on the use of psychedelics and their history in medicine. So you were mentioning that it was used for treatments or not necessarily treatments for schizophrenia, but for people who are treating schizophrenia to alter their perceptions in such a way that may help them empathize with those patients who are suffering from those afflictions. But it was also used, I believe, also as a treatment for alcoholism, or at least attempted to be used in that regard as well. Can you let me know a little bit more about that?
Sure. Part of what the ethic was at the time was that the researchers themselves, so they're psychiatrists, psychologists, a couple of social workers, staff, psych nurses, are taking the drug in this effort to empathize. And one of the things that they found in comparing their notes and sometimes taking this together was that it reminded them of some of the things that their alcoholic patients had told them about. You know, when they hit rock bottom, when they were having severe delirium tremens, sometimes when they were hospitalized for some of the very serious physiological effects that they were experiencing. And said, you know, it sounds a little bit like that point at which they start hallucinating and they're scared really out of their skin, so to speak. And what if we could give them LSD to sort of hijack that experience? We know that sometimes when people hit rock bottom, that's the first time they seriously ask for help. What if we can get them there before their body deteriorates, before their liver shuts down? So they thought maybe this would scare them, and it didn't really work that way, because very early on they found that people didn't get scared of the LSD experience. They quite enjoyed it. However, it did still function as a moment of self-reflection. And so they would give very large doses relative to your blood or acid hits, or even relative to some of the volunteers who were taking these in other settings. The alcoholics were given large doses, and then they would have these really intense periods of self-reflection. Now, they were not left alone, and they were usually coached through in a kind of psychotherapeutic method. So they would be asked to talk about why they drink. They would be asked to talk about their families, their employers.
And people were able to remain coherent through these interviews.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't affect your ability to interact with another person,
No.
just your perceptions during the time?
It's true. although many people did feel withdrawn and they didn't want to necessarily talk during the experience, usually these would be about a 2-day period. So you would come in, you were often prepped in advance, so not only would you take a physical examination, but often to determine whether there was any liver damage in the first place, severe liver damage. These are alcoholics. But also to have people prepare by reading transcripts of others' experiences or reading Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley's account of his mescaline experience. And this was to prepare people because the experiences were not uniform. It wasn't, that everyone would see purple dots or, that there was some kind of thing that you could expect or know that something was happening. It usually takes about an hour for the effects to start occurring, and so they would bring in photographs. Sometimes you were encouraged to bring in photographs of your family. Over time, they brought in music. Almost always this was classical music, and they determined that Beethoven was better than most other kinds of music. They brought in Impressionist painters, Van Gogh. They really liked the kind of multi-brush strokes that they felt were easy to concentrate on and also started to blur as you started experiencing hallucinations.
So almost trying to enhance what the drug itself might be doing to the patients.
Enhance as well as try to decrease the anxiety. Like, when am I going to see a monster? Am I going to, if you're worried about seeing something come out in a three-dimensional way, these were pleasant images to get lost in.
Okay.
So this was try to ease people in. If they wanted to withdraw, that was fine, but there was always someone in the room who had direct personal experience with the drug before. So you couldn't be a guide if you hadn't taken the drug. You were sat with the entire time. Usually you got Valium or niacin at the end of it to ensure that you got a good night's sleep, and you were monitored the whole time. And the next day you would write up your own transcript of the experience. So in that way, if you wanted to engage during the experience, you could, but many people go quiet. And instead, a nurse is writing down, Derek is quiet, Derek is staring at his notes, So we have some sense as to what you were doing, even if you weren't talking. And the next day, often it's a much more fulsome description of what you were experiencing.
So you mentioned Aldous Huxley in this, and as I understand, this was sort of a worldwide phenomenon that was taking place at this time, and notable figures like Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, were sort of tangentially or maybe directly involved in some of these things?
Absolutely. So Huxley's really interesting because he had, of course, if you've read Brave New World, he has this drug soma, and we don't really know what it is, and it kind of is this window into a new utopic or dystopic world, but certainly one where drugs reign supreme. And he had a real fascination in drugs and in the ways in which drugs affect mind and perception. So when he learned about these trials that were going on, he contacted one of the researchers, Humphrey Osmond, then living in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And Humphrey took supplies of mescaline, drove to Los Angeles from Weyburn, and provided him with his first mescaline experience. And it was that, on the basis of that experience and that friendship which blossomed through that interaction, that he wrote Doors of Perception. And this carried on then in 10 years until Huxley died. They wrote quite regular letters to each other, really contemplating what it meant to take these drugs. And it was through their friendship and their interactions that the word psychedelic was coined.
Yeah, now that was coined here, was it not? Mm. Yeah.
It was through their letters, yeah.
Through their letters, yeah. So a bit of a interesting origin story of that word. I guess it was what psyche for the mind and...
Delos, to bring to light.
Right. Which, based on some of the experiences, it sounds like they had on some of their trips to the desert, may have been a fairly poignant way of describing what it was they were experiencing.
Well, it's really interesting because this is such a unique moment where you've got these two British erudite, articulate men who are deeply infused in the literary scene as well as philosophy, medicine, science, and you've got them corresponding and thinking about these things, and both of them feel kind of alienated from their own worlds. Neither of them are living in England anymore. Huxley's in Los Angeles and feeling a bit strange as a transported American or, an imported Brit in America. And Osmond feels the same way. Here he is in this wind-blown prairie town town. His wife doesn't recognize any of the department stores or anything in small town Weyburn. And they strike up this friendship that's really interesting because it gives them, I think, the freedom to really flex their intellectual muscle when they're thinking about the philosophy of science and the ways in which the mind interacts with the environment and these intoxicants. And it's really quite a beautiful relationship that develops there.
Yeah, just that perfect storm, I guess, of the right people at the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Which I find absolutely fascinating. You know, not only was so much of this work going on, which I was completely unaware. I didn't know that Saskatchewan was at all involved in any of that sort of research, let alone that it was involved to such a significant degree as to attract the attention of somebody like Aldous Huxley, who is, I guess, famous at this point for asking for and receiving LSD on his deathbed.
Yeah, so in 1963, his cancer progresses to such a state that he asks his wife to inject him with LSD, and he's tried a variety of different psychedelics at this point, that they are now calling psychedelics, and he said, this drug helps to release the anxiety of dying. It helps to release you from the mortal bonds of this living, and to be okay with death. It's really interesting to me in particular because he had also nursed his previous wife, Maria, through her cancer, and he too referred to their shared mescaline experiences, and he said that was so critical to her care and to helping her ease the pain, not the physical pain, but the mental anguish, the fear of dying that came with palliative care, essentially. And I think he articulates this in a really beautiful way as a literary giant as he is, but he talks about the ways in which, all of our pharmaceutical care, and this is the 1950s still, so it's still fairly early, it doesn't do anything to help with mind care or mindfulness of dying care. And it was a really interesting and poignant moment, and I think it is one of the areas where we may see the future of psychedelics getting some renewed attention.
Well, I know there was an article in CBC, I believe, where they had chatted with you as well. And usually CBC follows up after us. They see us and then they ring us up. And try
of course.
But you were speaking to them about the use of LSD in palliative care. Now, is this something that's gaining traction, or is this something that is just beginning to see some proponents, people advocating for it?
There have been a few studies in the United States on oncology wards, and there are a few researchers there looking specifically at these kinds of questions. I think it's interesting in part because in the 1950s and 60s, during sort of the heyday of the legitimate therapeutic experiments with LSD and other psychedelics, we didn't really have palliative care wards. And the focus on dying care was not as acute, and there wasn't as much momentum or funding directed at it as there is today. This is sort of shifted in our healthcare landscape, and I think there might be some more political momentum and political reasons to focus on dying care as a more humane exercise now. The other thing is, and what Huxley and Osmond point out in their correspondence, is that we got to remember this is sort of the beginning of randomized controlled trials when psychedelics come into play. So they were writing up case reports before this. Within a case report, you can capture all sorts of different kinds of experiences. Maybe people see God, maybe they see demons. That still has a place in the case report. But often in the randomized controlled trial context, the measuring of experiences is captured and it's sort of blocked into different areas. Spirituality, they argue, gets pushed out of the clinical trial context. And other researchers have noticed this too. There's new research right now in Switzerland looking at brain imaging studies, looking for, where does spirituality fit in the brain? Now, I don't know where that's going to go necessarily, but it is interesting that in palliative care, it's the one place where we bring spirituality back. And maybe there might be an opportunity here for a bit of a reconciliation between the kind of healing and healthcare needs we have at that stage of life, or even perhaps more broadly, but this might be the place where we start to see that renewed.
Well, that certainly sounds like an interesting future application and area of research. I would love to keep on chatting. Unfortunately, we're just getting to the end of our time here. So for anybody who's wanting to know more, please know that you can check out, so we've got this one. This is the one that came out of your thesis?
Yep.
So Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, as well as there's Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD on the Canadian Prairies, both available on Amazon, as well as some of her other books as well. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll see you next time on Talks on Tap.